This is Congress, and this recorded lecture, which actually should have been posted last week, but because of my lethargy, etc., and my faultiness as a human being, I just could not produce. But this lecture is going to finish up. Actually, I'm going to sneeze, so I'm going to pause the recording. I just went through two massive sneezes, and I didn't want to sneeze on the microphone and on the computer and transmit my contagious senility or whatever I've got to you. Um, so this lecture is to finish up the introductory material on what the Congress isn't, that is to say, looking at its antecedents, which we had done in our previous discussion, and to finish with Locke, because the critical thing is Locke does contribute a major aspect of our constitutional theory and our understanding of what the legislature is and does. And then in the next video, which will be prior to our discussion on Tuesday night, I'll lay out the founder's understanding of what the Congress is, the theory of the Congress under the uh, uh, Constitution. And for shorthand purposes, I'm going to refer to that as the founder's design as the Madisonian institution. Even though when we look at some of the Federalist Papers that describe the construction of the Congress, Hamilton had a hand in composing those essays, but nevertheless, the bulk, now some of you who have had me in class before, again, as I mentioned, I have Federalist 10 and 51 tattooed on some portion of my anatomy. But when I say the Madisonian Legislature, that term will take on a fairly concrete meaning, I hope, in the discussion in the next video. And the purpose of that is to kind of frame the whole question, the evaluative question of how well Congress is working as an institution now. How well does it embody its original design? Or even perhaps the larger question, whether or not its original design still fits our governing needs, and whether or not the institution is broadly functional or dysfunctional, regardless of whether it embodies the intentions of the designers and the framers. So this lecture again will finish up with Locke and a kind of a broad description of what the Congress is, using, by the way, the notes which I'll accompany the link to this video, and also my great comparogram that I developed a couple of years ago, and I've walked you part of the way through that, talking about Rome and mixed regime in Britain, and then the transitional phase of the American state constitutions, in which, remember, again, just to be clear, the theory of the mixed regime is that the institutions of government have to be linked to social or economic classes. And specifically, of course, the mixed regime was a theory of how you balance the aristocratic upper chamber Senate and a popular lower chamber representative or House of Commons or the tribunes. And the whole point in taking you up so far is this is why you have to understand what Congress is against the larger background of constitutional theory, that the American Constitution rejects the whole theory of the mixed regime, that the American Constitution is profoundly democratic or popular. And you'll see when we turn in the next video to explaining Madison's theory of the legislature, that the theory, the functions of the representative legislature will be part of a larger, that'll be the foreground or part of a larger background and constitutional theory about the nature of the Constitution as a popular or Republican institution. In Federalist 39, which I'll come back to in the next lecture, Madison defines a Republican government as a government in which all the power derives directly or indirectly from the people. And one of the things you'll see when we finish up with Locke and then move to the Constitutional Congress is indeed there is no non-popular element. There is no House of Lords. There is no aristocratic class. First of all, because Article 1, Section 9 and Section 10 of the Constitution forbid the Congress and the state legislatures to create titles of nobility. So there's no possibility of even generating a social class, which would subsequently then find its representation. Now, if you remember from the last discussion when we talked about the transitional state constitutions, remember our constitutional theory had not been fully worked out under the period of the Articles. Therefore, probably six to half of the states did have bicameral legislatures where the 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 lower chamber, the larger house, was popularly elected, and where the franchise was fairly widely distributed. And then, oftentimes, again, at least half the legislatures, the upper chambers, the Senate, was, if not class based, property based, where you had to have a certain amount of property in order to vote for the members of the Senate, or you had to have a certain amount of property in order to serve in the Senate. So, as you'll see, there's none of that in the final Constitution and in the construction of the Congress. So, uh, let me pick up with where what I didn't finish, and that's on this side of the um, comparogram, what the Constitutional Congress is sort of. And this is, of course, it's not enough just to coin a handy phrase. You have to have a clumsy academic description of it. The Lockean legislature, which is, again, by the time you get to Locke, you're probably 80% of where we are in terms of Congress, our Congress and our Constitutional Congress, but not quite there. And I mentioned in the last lecture, one of the things that pushes us and makes the American founding not simply an embodiment of pre-existing philosophic thought on the part of famous philosophers, but why there is genuinely statesmanly and institutional and theoretical creativity. And that is, of course, the written Constitution, which is in some ways the major contribution that America and the American founding contributes to politics in the modern world. So, reading from the left hand side of the page, what the Constitutional Congress is sort of, and this is again the Lockean legislature. What is that? The non tyrannical, functionally divided supreme legislature. And this is again comes from Locke's Sacred Treatise, and to some degree Montesquieu from the Spirit of Laws. Given that at the end of the last lecture, I pointed out that Locke is the originator of the theory of separation of powers. That is to say, now different institutions with different functions and characters, not based on a social class or amount of property or wealth or some kind of pre-political or pre-institutional identity, but rather institutions which are differentiated by their function. That's the theory of separation of powers and checks and balances. Starts with the idea that you can take the functions of government and divide them up into three big chunks. Now, in other places and venues, when I talk about the constitutional theory of the United States, and I talk about the separation of powers and checks and balances, now let me just briefly speak about that now, because obviously, in terms of the ongoing development and functioning of our Congress and our government, the theory of the separation of powers and checks and balances hovers over everything. Um, and it's good to think, just at least for a second, um, what Locke had in mind by picking three. I mean, here's a logical question. Why not the nine functions of government? Why not have, or two? I mean, obviously you want more than one, because if you only have one function in one institution, that leads to the definition of tyranny in Locke and Montesquieu, which is the concentration of all power in one set of hands or institutions, which is also embraced and adopted by the founders as their definition of tyranny. So you want more than one institution, because even if you've got a King Solomon or a King Arthur or a Joe Dunn, who combines all aspects of human wisdom in their tiny little brains, um, then still that concentration of all powers, even if it's in one institution that's not a single person, that has a tendency to absolutize itself and is almost a guaranteed ticket to tyranny. So you could say that the separation of powers and checks and balances, you're going to see that those are not identical, as we'll talk about this in Federalist 51 in the next lecture. Um, that that okay, that means you need at least two institutions functionally differentiated. So you have to come up with dividing the power and functions of government at least into two. What's the matter with two? Well, if you've been married, you know what the problem with two is. One side always wins. I'm just kidding about that. But I mean, you could say, okay, and this almost has a Pythagorean, if you go back to Pythagorean number theory, where two is the number of opposition and stasis and competition, but three is the number of synthesis and proper functioning. Because if you have something divided into three, just imagining a triangle, then in some ways each point balances the other two off, and everything is so you have triangulation, literally the term that it was invented by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Uh, that is to say, you have 3 points that balance off. So let me just speculate here. Why then three and not four, or four institutions or powers? Why not 5 or 9 or 20? Well, because actually, and Locke was aware of this, defending this from Hobbes, that you don't want one for reasons that we saw that leads to tyranny. You need more than two, because otherwise you get crisis and imbalance, or what we today might call gridlock, which you get anyway, but more about that later, of course. But then why not more than? Because it turns out you can't multiply the functions and the powers of government and divide the institutional power up of government too much, or else you lead to paralysis and a dissolution of the necessary energy that government requires. So why three? Why does the separation of powers then seem to single on three powers? Because you can see that from Locke to Montesquieu, what the three powers are is some matter of disagreement and debate. As I mentioned in the last lecture, Locke divides the three powers of government up into legislative, executive, and federative. And what we call, but it's Montesquieu who reconfigures them as legislative, executive, and judicial. Whereas in Locke, the what we call the executive, which is the enforcing function, and the judicial function, which we call the interpretive or punitive function, they were combined in the same institution. Um, uh, a fairly deep reason, which I won't go into now, it has to do with the way the human mind operates. But uh, the but Montesquieu, and that left the third power, which Locke calls the federative power, as the foreign affairs power. Because he argued you can't, that's a completely separate function from the internal functions of legislation and enforcement and interpretation. Montesquieu, uh, in some ways, takes that foreign affairs function, and the framers followed Montesquieu on this, and kind of divide it between the executive and legislative functions. And we'll come back to this somewhat later on in the course, and we certainly deal with this in my presidency class, um, where the power to engage in foreign affairs is split between the executive and the legislative branch. Like the president negotiates. Hold on one second. Now, what was I talking about? I just got off the phone. The separation of powers. So, so here's the main point I want to make: is it seems to me that Locke settles on three because that is the minimal necessary to prevent tyranny, and the maximum that is consistent with coherence in governance. So the point here then is that the three governing institutions then are not associated with class or wealth or anything, but rather associated with function. And as you'll see for the rest of this course, we'll be discussing what the legislative function, the lawmaking function, and how that both dovetails with, and as you'll see in the next couple of weeks, how that stands in tension with and sometimes conflicts with um, the representative function. Again, as I mentioned in our first discussions, that's the whole approach of Davidson and Olizik and Lee and whatever the fourth person's name is. It used to be for many years Davidson and Olizik, but all political scientists get old and senile, and they need people to help update these endless editions. What is this, the 300th edition of Congress and Matters? But as I said before, it's the best text available on Congress. So, but the point is that they take their bearing from, they organize their study of Congress around these two core functions, and that it's actually two institutions in one. It's certainly two functions in the same institution, and part of understanding Congress is how it works those two functions out and tries to combine them, sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. So to go back to the diagram, what the Constitution Congress sort of is the Lockean predecessor. The common good, and I kind of went on about this at the end of the last lecture, but let me just repeat this now. The common good is attained by one, and as Madison says in Federalist 51, and Aristotle, Plato say, even Machiavelli, who says it's all about power and do unto others before they can do unto you. Everybody admits that somehow politics is about the common good. How do you get from the clashing interests of society and the self-interest of individuals to an institutional life which formulates the common good? That's the big question of politics, and was the big question at the time of the founding. So the common good is attained by one, society founded upon legislative power or the rule of law embodied in a supreme legislature. And I talked about the reasons for that. For Locke, if you're going to have the rule of law govern society, then the institution that has to be that has the supreme power is the legislative power, in order to ensure the primacy and the predominance of the rule of law. Now, as you're going to see, the framers worked this out in a different way, uh, because again, they had certain practical experience with the supreme legislature, which didn't always suggest that just because the legislature is supreme, that is to say, the legislative body controls the core functions and power in society. That doesn't mean that the rule of law actually always follows from that. Because to use a quote from Jefferson, who was criticizing the legislature of the state of Virginia in the Federalist Papers and quoted by Madison, even 153 tyrants is just as bad as one. And one of the things we'll see that the framers learned prior to the construction of our own institutions was, it turns out tyranny can come not only from a bad king or even a unrestrained president or a single person or dictator. Tyranny can come from a legislature, and it can even come from a court. And of course, uh, in the wider sense, the framers learned that even a democratic majority can be tyrannical. The people themselves can be tyrannical. So as you're going to see, the framers departed from Locke not on the necessity of the rule of law as the foundation of good government, but on the teaching of the supremacy of the legislative institution in the constellation of governmental institutions. And as I already suggested at the end of the last lecture, the way that the mechanism by which they did that was um, the evolution of the written constitution, and what that means we'll talk more about in a little bit. So, second, a separation of powers of government, which prevents the concentration of power that constitutes tyranny. I just talked about that a little bit. Third, the separation of powers that constitutes good government by institutions which embody, in appropriate structure, the core functions of government, a division of labor balanced against each other. And as I already explained, in Locke's view of the legislative, executive, and federative functions, or in Montesquieu, the legislative, executive, and judicial functions, with the latter two subordinated to the legislature. So if you're looking at my handy diagram, the way I pictured that is all right, Locke says, okay, the people are the society, the people. On the level of society, the people that form the society are the source of all legitimate authority. That's the doctrine of consent. Um, and what do and should they consent to on the level of institutions? Their first act is to constitute a supreme legislative body, which then designates separate institutions, which, generally speaking, either the legislature chooses, certainly supervises and controls by having the bulk of power, because the function of the legislative, the executive, and let me just do a little bit of etymology. Executive comes from the Latin roots ex, which means out, and sequere, which means to follow. So to carry out, to follow something, like so, and that's our kind of eighth grade civics understanding of these things. The legislative makes the law, the executive carries out the law, and then the judiciary or the federative authority applies or interprets the law. So we're about uh, ready to finish this lecture and summarize the core essence of the Constitutional Congress in the U.S. Constitution. But before I do that, I want to go back and finish up a specific discussion of uh, Locke's second treatise, which I asked you to read, and that's the last page of this notes. And again, I know I've sent these out before, but I'm going to assume that you probably printed them off and sent them to members of your family so that they should have a living legacy of your college education. Um, and so starting with B, the theorist of the modern legislature, the modern constitution. So I've already talked about the overall considerations. Um, Now, Locke says the first task of the legislative power of the rule of law is to decide rules for the acquisition and maintenance of property, since property is sacred to the individual and the necessary ground of society's prosperity. And because I'm not accusing any of you of shoplifting or stealing, but there is a certain sense in which the unequal amounts of property lead to envy, and all the great political philosophers say this. Madison says this in Federalist 10. And therefore, one of the first things the law has to do is to establish how to own property, how to acquire property, and how to protect property through law. And again, since property, and you could say, by the way, like sexual eros, not only sexual eros, but property eros, makes people do crazy things. They rob banks, they engage in Ponzi schemes, they embezzle, and they run for Congress. I'm just kidding about the last part. Um, and therefore, the reason you want the law to do this is because law, as we already said, is a general principle found out by reason. So a good law has at its core a general principle expressing the common good of society, which transcends the individual rootedness in passion and self-interest. And it's the best expression of the common good. And if you can keep governmental power within a legal framework, it's less tyrannical. Although the law can become tyrannical, do remember that. So the separation of powers is now functional, and we already talked about that. Now, the main thing I want to focus on um, in the rest of Locke is how he recommends that the legislative institution be constructed, and what are the intrinsic and inherent limits on legislative power. And so let's turn to the second one first. He says there are four intrinsic aspects of law or limits that where you can't have well constituted legislative authority without these being built into the structure of the legislature or the way it functions as a legislative body. First, he says law cannot be arbitrary. It has to come from a fixed and standing, dis, discernible source. And again, it has to be focused on a rational principle. It can't be the result of whim or even the self interest of the legislators. So, by the way, if you want to follow the philosophical dimensions of this modern, well, and the rule of law is not a modern notion. I mean, that's intrinsic in all political thought and philosophy, ancient and modern, Eastern and Western. But there is a certain sense in which reason as moral generality does, which kind of begins with Locke and then takes its expression with Rousseau and the general will, if you've had modern political philosophy. Um, but then also Kant, whom I don't read in my modern political philosophy class because I can barely get through two authors as it is. But you've probably heard the term the Kantian categorical imperative. That is to say, for Kant, a moral law is one that is found out by reason and is applicable to the general class of the relevant class as a class. And that, generally speaking, what is moral is what you would say is a generality for everybody, in our case, human beings, um, and that any departure from a general law that binds all human beings is in the direction of self-interest and immorality. So no, so the first intrinsic limit is law has to be non-arbitrary. It has to be rational and principled. Second, it the law and the laws have to take the form of standing and settled rules. They can't change every hour, every minute, every year, every election, um, because if you're going to have a society based on the rule of law, that means that the members of the society have to have the chance to know the law. And therefore, you're going to see, by the way, when we turn to the American founding, one of the criticisms of the state legislatures is that they were so tied to democratic shifts in public opinion that often several of the state legislatures had terms. One state had terms as short as 3 months. Many of them had 6-month terms. Probably the default setting was a year term. But the problem is, if you're having that frequent elections in order to make sure that the institution is simply representative of shifts in public opinion, again, that representative function, then that begins to undermine the capacity of the society to live under law, because you need a certain stable presence of the law for people to get to know it, understand it, and live under it. Third, no deprivation of property without consent. And this principle should be familiar to you as Americans. No taxation without representation. And so, in some ways, not only does the law have to say under what conditions people can be legally deprived of their property, say as a fine for a crime or something like that, but under what under what circumstances taxation is fair. Um, and and since taxation does deprive you of your property, but if the taxation comes from an act of a legal enactment, from people chosen by the people, from representative chosen by the people, then what you give up in taxes, you're actually consenting to give up. And the last, fourth intrinsic limitation that Locke discusses is no delegation of legislative authority. The legislative body cannot cannot give away its power to make laws. Now, that doctrine survives in our Constitution and is both judicially affirmed and is embodied textually in the Constitution's vesting clauses, where the vesting clause in Article 1, 2, and 3, all legislative powers here in granted shall be vested in the Congress. The executive power shall be vested in the president. Um, the vesting clauses say that not only that power belongs to you. Now, this is true both the executive and the judicial branch, and that means that it's a violation of the Constitution when the other branches try to take some essential power away from you. But the other implication of this, especially with legislative power, is you can't give it away. You can't delegate it to another branch or government or individual. And that's, again, that doctrine is called the non-delegation doctrine, or the non-delegability of legislative authority. And in the New Deal, for instance, the pre-1937 court invalidated much of the New Deal legislation on the grounds that the laws passed by Congress under the Roosevelt administration were so vague that they were not much more than like a blank coloring book or a blank check, and it left either the industry parties or the relevant administrative organs in the executive branch to fill in the details. Law has to have a clear principle, and a law has to actually decide policy. And the way that works out in our own system is Congress can't pass a law that says to the president, "Here's a problem. Do with it what you want." So that goes all the way back to Locke, and so my point about these four intrinsic limits is they are intrinsic. Locke says without these aspects of legislative authority built into the way the legislature works in that society, you can't have good legislative power. It's a contradiction in terms. You could say, well, anything that's a bad version of anything means it's not that thing. But strictly speaking, what Locke is saying is without these four limits, legislative power is almost doomed to become tyrannical and the opposite of what laws are supposed to be. He also says, by the way, and we'll come back to this because of this, he says the executive and the federal have to be subordinated to the legislative authority. But again, you'll see the written constitution changes this because what do we call the Constitution according to Article 6? The supreme law of the land. In our system with the written Constitution, that society forming function that Locke said was the supreme function of the legislative body is actually delegated to the Constitution. So the written Constitution, stands as the supreme legislative act of the people constituting government. Then this supreme law that hovers, that is the legitimate embodiment of the people's consent and operates as a fundamental law, then that supreme constitution creates the three functioning institutions of government, including now the legislature. But in doing so, it also then, in some ways, it subordinates the legislature to a higher law, and it also then raises the constitutional status of the other two branches. And that's why in our system we consider the legislative branch not to be the supreme branch, but rather a co-equal branch, because the Constitution puts all three institutions of government under its own authority as the supreme law of the land. So, so in a way, what the written Constitution does is create a super legislature called the people, speaking through the Constitution, and then creates a subordinate governing legislature called the Congress, along with the co-equal branches of the president and the judiciary. Now, the other kind of teaching about the legislative body that comes out of Locke is what I would call prudential. And by prudential, I mean it's a good idea. The four limitations that we talked about above are absolutely necessary. But as I said in the last lecture, these recommendations uh, are prudential in the sense is if you want to increase the likelihood of having a well-constructed legislative power, you will follow my advice and construct the legislature this way. And so again, remember, strictly speaking, if you had, say, a king with the wisdom of Solomon, then you could say, the legislative branch will consist of one person, one supremely wise person who already can see the common good of society, and through his own self-contained wisdom, the best way to form laws is to let that individual form the generalities that society lives under. Again, but the likelihood of getting somebody that wise in a single person, with the exception of my department chair, is very low. Therefore, Locke recommends that the legislative body be numerous. Why? Because you have a number of individuals and voices. You could say a supreme legislative dictator, king, ruler, could sit there and meditate by himself and formulate through his brilliant reason the common good of society. But if you turn the legislative function over to a numerous body, then the only way that a numerous body, unless they're all telepathic, can function is by discussion and debate. And therefore, Locke is going to tie, as do the framers, the quality of the legislative function of creating a rational principle that expresses the good of society. They The argument is the best way to formulate a general rule is to have many different voices debating and talking and then voting. So, with the presumption that with a numerous body comes the necessity of deliberation and discussion as its core activity, and that's the platform of the legislative function, that's really Locke. Now, you could say, well, wait a minute, doesn't simply increasing the number, if you've ever been to say something numerous and cacophonous at the same time, such as a faculty meeting, a college faculty meeting, just simply turning a function over to a bunch of talkers and debaters ensure that that debate is rational? Can it just be noisy and cacophonous and actually undermine the ability to do things? Believe me, I've been a member of faculty governing bodies in 6 institutions, and yes, sometimes uh, multiplying the numbers of the occupants of an institution does not necessarily guarantee rational debate. Grant that. But at any rate, we'll see. And when it comes to constructing the House and the Senate, you'll see, obviously, both the House and the Senate are numerous bodies, but here's a big shocker. The House is larger, typically from the beginning until now, 4 times larger than the Senate. So even though you need a numerous body, it turns out that having a more and less numerous body does have an effect on how that body of individuals performs its deliberative function. Diverse, they should be from around different parts of the country, because if the law is to express the common good of the country, then probably it's good to have people from all of the different parts of the country so that they contribute their partial understanding to the emergent common good. And elected. And that's, again, that's comes to be called the representative function. And then he says meeting from time to time. It's not good to have the legislative body sit all the time, because their propensity would be then to keep making new laws, and that would undermine or conflict with one of the intrinsic requirements, which is standing set of laws. So Locke says it's better to have the legislature only meet part of the year, and then, of course, what would be doing the rest of them? They would be going back to the places that they represent and the people they represent, and living under the laws that they formulated. So, a body that doesn't meet all the time is probably the best way. So that they have to be elected and reelected to represent the people they legislate over, but that they also have the opportunity to go back and live under the laws that they have formulated. Now, as you're going to see in